A few months ago, a friend told me something that stopped me in my tracks. They said, grief feels like love with nowhere to go. Have you ever felt that way? Like your heart is overflowing with something you can't express, something raw and heavy. Today I want to invite you into a sacred space, a garden, if you will, where mourning isn't avoided, but honored, where grace meets us in our most fragile moments, where Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4 remind us of something profound. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Grief isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of deep love. It's a sacred space where love and loss hold hands, and we're reminded of just how deeply we've cared, just how deeply we've been connected. When Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn," he's not dismissing our pain. He's honoring it. He's naming it as holy ground. I remember a season in my own life when grief felt like a heavy fog. It was hard to see through it, hard to breathe inside it. But in those moments, there was something sacred, even in the ache. I felt a presence, not fixing, not explaining, just there. Grief is not the opposite of love. It is love, expressed in the language of loss. But what happens in that space? What does God's comfort actually look like when we're mourning? You see, grace doesn't bypass grief. It enters into it. It doesn't rush healing. It sits patiently beside us, holding space for our pain. In rebel grace theology, grace isn't earned. It's not a reward for getting through the grief correctly, air quotes. Grace is what meets us in the middle of the mess, unasked, unearned, but deeply needed. In Buddhism, the concept of dukkha teaches us to sit with suffering, not avoid it. In Islam, sabir, patience in suffering, is seen as an act of deep spiritual trust in God. Modern psychology echoes these ancient truths. Grief isn't something to get over. It's something to move through. I once heard a man share about sitting by his mother's hospital bed in her final days, and he described it as the hardest yet holiest moment of his life. He said, "I felt God sitting with us in the silence." Grace doesn't fix grief. That's important to know. It simply transforms it. It plants seeds of hope in the dark soil of our sorrow. But let's be honest, grief is hard, and many of us do everything we can to avoid it. When we're faced with grief, many of us turn away. We distract ourselves with work, with busyness, with anything that keeps us from feeling the full weight of our sorrow. We hear phrases like, "everything happens for a reason," or "just stay strong." But those words don't heal. They just add to our isolation. I had a friend who lost their partner. Instead of grieving, they poured themselves into their career. Long hours, endless projects, anything to stay busy. And on the surface, they looked fine. But grief doesn't disappear. It waits. And when they finally stopped running, they realized grace had been waiting for them in the silence all along. When we avoid grief, we also avoid the comfort God promises. The sacred garden of mourning remains untended, and the seeds of grace struggle to grow. So, how do we step into that sacred garden? How do we allow grace to meet us there? Well, like any garden, it needs time. It needs tending. It needs our presence. I'm going to give you 3 steps to begin tending that garden. Number 1, name your grief. Say it out loud. Write it down in a journal. Be honest with yourself and with God. When I was moving through heart-wrenching pain, I would just stop, feel it, cry it out, name it, and let it go. Number 2, let others in. You don't have to carry grief alone. Invite someone you trust to sit with you, not to fix it, just to be there. Number 3, create sacred space. Take 5 minutes this week. Sit quietly. Pray, journal, or just watch the sunset. Be still. Wherever you are right now, sitting in your car, walking outside, or doing the dishes, take a deep breath. Think of one place in your life where grief lives. Just name it silently to yourself. Now, imagine God sitting next to you in that space, not fixing, not explaining, just present. That's grace. That's love. This week, let's also create space for someone else's grief. Send a text. Share a quiet moment. Show up not with answers, but with presence. This week, give yourself permission to grieve, to cry, to weep. Even if it's just 5 minutes. Notice where grace shows up in a memory or a small moment of peace or a release. Ask yourself, where in my life am I avoiding grief? And how might I invite God's presence into that space this week? Grief isn't something to overcome. It's something to honor. It's holy ground where God plants seeds of comfort and hope. God of love, you see our tears. You hear our cries, and you hold our hearts in your gentle hands. Teach us the trust that in mourning, it is not weakness, but a sacred act of love. May we find courage to grieve, presence to sit with our sorrow, and hope to believe that even here, grace is at work. Amen. Remember, grief isn't a detour from grace. It's often the very road where grace arrives. If this message spoke to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Follow this channel for more reflections on grace, love, and healing. And remember, grace meets us in our grief.